Before we get started, just a quick note, spoiler alert.
And we are adults, and I will try very hard not to use adult language, but this is the warning.
Welcome back to Last Library on the Left. This is our second episode. My name is Jennifer.
And my name is Sadina. And we are a horror and review discussion podcast where we talk about horror in books, movies, and other formats, why we seek it out, and why we need it in our lives.
And today we're going to be talking about boundaries and how they correlate with consuming horror in your everyday life. And this is a topic I'm very excited to talk about today.
I'm pretty excited too. I hope that the fact that we're not recording in the same room doesn't bog us down too much, but I think this is going to be a good discussion.
I agree. I think that when you are consuming horror, a lot of times you don't think about it, but horror is very necessary in helping you to understand what your boundaries are, setting them, and also making sure no one crosses those boundaries that are just uncrossable.
Right. You don't know those boundaries as a child. As a child, you not necessarily go off instinct, but you go off what the world around you provides. And so if you're not exposed to, I don't know, I definitely had a stranger upbringing as a child than most people did. So when I was later confronted with certain forms of abuse or crises, I was able to better psychologically handle them. And I don't think most people could have handled them in the same way because they were not exposed to the horror elements and knowing and learning their boundaries and how to either cope with them or how to, in some circumstances, bend their boundary temporarily.
Right. Now, my upbringing was a little bit different. I would say that I was more sheltered in the real world. So I didn't experience a lot of real world situations until I got older, but I consumed a lot of horror as a child. The very first horror movie I ever watched was A Nightmare on Elm Street. So I got that exposure to horror early in life. It helped me sort of unconsciously prepare for a lot of the things that I would be dealing with and seeing later on in life, which thank goodness, because I don't know how I would have been prepared for some of the situations that I have dealt with in my life.
That's one part about horror that I really hope a lot of people grow to appreciate, either as consumers themselves or allowing the children in their lives to consume horror or setting boundaries themselves for children. I had a boss in Boston when I was a children's librarian there, my first children's librarian gig, and my boss would tell me that it's not our job to project our fears onto children, our expectations onto children and what they consume. It's their job to learn it on their own to a point. And so this doesn't have to do with horror, but I hate Amelia Bedelia. Ugh, just no. And I would have to remember that my issues with classism, with not necessarily sexism, but the way that she was treated because she took everything so literally, wasn't that she was dumb. It was just that the people around her, she was in a maid's outfit. It was a very classist interpretation and dumbing down of this female character that I just really resented, and that I couldn't project that onto the children who liked her.
Agreed. There are a lot of things that everyone by now should know. I am a caregiver, I'm a parent. And one of the things that I really hate is when I was growing up, there was that whole, if you can't say anything nice, don't say anything at all. And keeping a lot of things kind of hidden was deemed weird. So for myself growing up, I kept a lot of myself and my personality a secret because I couldn't get it out because I was just too weird. And so now as a parent, I try not to put those norms on my daughter. Anything that I don't like, regardless of what it is, type of media, a book, a character, I try not to put that on her because I don't want to influence her to not like something just because I don't like it. She can make her own decisions and I can help guide her, but I think ultimately she's growing into her own person, her own human being, and it's up to her to define her likes and dislikes.
Yeah, that's a really good point. The other day, we picked up my niece from the airport and we were asking her questions about her trip and what she enjoyed and what she did, how her flight was, did she take a nap? And my baby sister asked, was the plane ride scary? And I immediately immediately whipped on her, and I was like, no, don't ask that. Don't put the thought into her head that planes are something to potentially be feared, because she has no concept of the aerodynamics of a plane or the probability of falling out of the sky or the gremlin on the side of the plane. She has no concept for that yet. And so to place a seed of there's the potential for fear on a plane, Nadine, I'm sorry if you're listening to this, I did not mean to snap at you, but it can really harm a child's development to put that first seed of fear or something to be feared in their head.
Yes. It's easy to see when you place that fear in a child's mind, how it affects them. And it's something that we shouldn't do, because it's up to them to decide in their teenage years, their adulthood, what they are fearful of and how they respond to that fear too. Because I've always been taught that when there's something that you fear, really you kind of step away from it and you try to move around it instead of confronting it. And only now in my adulthood am I actually confronting those things that I fear the most. And I'm in my late 30s, so it's taken a long time to realize that I can change my mindset. And I don't want to put those boundaries onto my child. I want her to be able to create her own boundaries, her own limitations, and decide when she wants to cross them.
That's one of the brilliant things about confronting quote unquote a horrific incident or scene in a book or a movie. There's this really amazing place in childhood development where you go from sorry, give me a second. Chainsaw's trying to go into the window. Go on. There you go.
Oh my goodness.
Now that he's creeping into the blinds full-bodied. Good boy. So there's this really fascinating thing that happens in early childhood development where I don't know if it's a similar development hurdle like the object permanence, where they all of a sudden realize that something exists when you no longer see it. But there's this interesting thing that occurs when you're developing as a child and as a reader, where you are scared reading something and then all of a sudden this light bulb goes off and you go, I don't actually have to keep reading. Like, I can stop. I can close this book and walk away and either finish it later or never finish it. And that's perfectly fine. Or I could stop scaring myself. I didn't have to finish a book to be accomplished. Or maybe it's the way that we learn how to read in school, where you read in circles and you take turns and you have to finish the passage or you have to finish the book or whatever it is. And then you get older and you're like, oh, I can actually hit pause on the movie, or, well, I'm actually not going to walk out of a movie theater because I'm cheap, but I will pause a movie and stop it and not go back. But yeah, those are fascinating parts about horror and why we consume them in these safe spaces.
You know, what you're saying is correct about when you're in school, you're reading in a circle or you're taking turns, however you're taking turns to finish that book. And also they've got so many reader programs with how many books have you completed.
Yeah.
So I think that really feeds into the you must finish a book. But then we also teach our kids when you start a task to finish it. And it's almost like goal setting, but we forget to tell them in other ways, well, if it's scary, if it's inciting fear, then let's reassess it and go back. And if you need to pause from this specific goal of finishing this book, then yeah, that's okay. Go ahead and pause it. I was an adult before I realized I could just put the book down. It was just ingrained in me naturally to just finish it no matter how bad a book was or how scary it was. But you're right. One of the great things about setting boundaries in horror is very easily close the book, turn the TV off. And if you want to, you can choose to come back to it, but you don't necessarily have to. And you've set yourself a boundary now. One of the other things I wanted to talk about of why boundaries are so important is I think once we recognize the boundaries that we have set for ourselves, it helps us to, well, maybe not all of us, but for the most part, it helps us to recognize boundaries within other people. And it also helps us to figure out when someone's trying to cross our boundaries or when we're trying to cross someone else's. And I like that self-realization aspect of boundary setting.
Man, that's a brilliant important point, because even as adults, maybe as a young adult in my 20 somethings, I still wasn't really great at considering the boundaries of other people, because it was difficult for me to understand why they could not push themselves as far as I could push myself, or they could not accept the same level of pressure that I could accept from an environmental distress. And it took me a long time to really not only accept but appreciate that those boundaries are sacred, and that those boundaries are to be respected and to be maybe even in some types protected. Some people have boundaries for a very good reason, and that boundary may need to be protected.
That's a really good point, because we talked about Nell and the caregivers from Hill House and their boundaries, and how Nell in the Netflix adaptation would have been different if she had learned to set boundaries early on, and how Shirley, the older sister, very clearly set her boundaries. She made sure she told everyone what her boundaries were, and she stuck by them. And I think it was very important for those characters. It just shows us as viewers the necessity of boundary setting.
Especially with someone like Shirley, who not only set her boundaries and voiced them, but she ferociously protected them.
Yes. In a lot of horror movies, especially like I was born in the 80s. I watched a lot of 80s, 90s horror. You have a lot of characters that they don't have boundaries, or there are some that do have boundaries. And a lot of times the ones that have the boundaries and stick to them are the ones that survive. The ones that don't have the boundaries are the ones that are getting knocked off like really early on. And so it's really interesting to see how boundaries play a part in horror as a whole, and how we adapt to that in real life, and how we learn from it in real life.
Even though I feel like some boundaries maybe change, which is, when we say boundary, we're not saying that it's a issue of this is where I stop pushing myself, or this is where I stop experiencing this thing. Sometimes it is, but not all of the times. Maybe something goes a little further. Like just a couple of weeks ago, I probably could have watched Hillbilly Elegy and gotten through it for the most part. I could not get through it now because of recent events in my family without being a complete sobbing mess.
And you bring up a good point about boundaries and their flexibility. When you set a boundary, it doesn't have to be that static line in the sand. It can always evolve and adapt to you as you evolve as a human being in the world, because we're always changing and our morals and our ethics are always being tested. And to be able to evolve those boundaries and even set stricter ones or loosen them up a bit is very important. And I think that no matter what you consume as far as media goes, if it's the news, you're reading a book, you're watching a movie or a show, something you see online, it's very much a part of how you consume it, how you receive it, and use it to set a boundary that's best fitting for yourself. And that's what we want to get across with horror and boundaries.
Yes, agreed. Everybody is different, and everybody's experience is different. And everybody experiences a horror movie slightly different too. You were telling me about your mom and Saw.
Yes. So one of the things that we'll be discussing are the movies that are hard-nosed for us. So as I was writing down my notes for this episode, I asked my mom, I said, well, Mom, what was the movie that really turned you off? You can't watch it again in terms of horror. She loves horror just as much as I do. And her movie is Saw. And so I asked her why, because to me, that's a fantastic movie. Love it.
Yeah.
And she said that, of course, the gore is a part of it. She doesn't like a lot of gore in movies, although she watched the slasher movies with me in the 80s and the 90s, so I don't get it. But she said that she didn't like the mental games that the character Jigsaw played, and that there were no real positive outcomes. I guess the outcomes for her weren't rosy enough, and it made her very uncomfortable. And she said it was just too much of real life, that she couldn't handle it. And she told me she's only seen the very first Saw.
That's interesting that she said it was too much like real life, because not everybody experiences that mental torture or mental gaslighting. And so to see that it can be not only harmful, but like genuinely triggering for someone who is uncomfortable with seeing the reality of it is interesting. That your mom was like, that's my thing, I can't do it.
Yeah, it was really interesting, because this is the same lady who just watches any old horror. Like, one of my things that I don't like is demon possession possession. It's one of the things that I can't do it. My mom will sit and watch just like nothing and go right to sleep. And it's not like, for me, if I watch demonic horror, I have to watch a Disney movie afterwards. I gotta read a romance to go to bed, and then I'm probably not sleeping. Like, it's really funny to see how we both consume horror and what is her boundary as opposed to what is normally my boundaries.
I have a similar story about my mom who, you know, got to see Alien and all of those classic 80s movies and sci-fi stuff. My mom was a major sci-fi person. I mean, like, Trekkie down to her bones. So when Prometheus came out, got it from work and watched it and was like, oh, this is so good. And I think that mom would really like it. She watched the Alien movies. And while she said the Alien kind of scared her, it was still very sort of up her alley because it was sci-fi. And I brought Prometheus over and she kind of warned me. She was like, is it scary? And I was like, no, it's not really scary, Mom. It's very atmospheric. It's good. And she's like, okay. And we get about halfway through the movie, and I think it's about the time when the storm kind of forces the expedition into the alien spaceship or whatever it was where they eventually got trapped in. She made me pause it, and she's like, I don't want to watch the rest of it. It's too much for me already. And I was like, really? Mom, it's fine. It's not scary. You're just getting worked up for nothing. And I kind of strong-armed her into finishing the movie. And by the time the movie was over, she was like, I didn't like it. It was too scary. Like, I'm not okay, you know? And I was like, well, I have to go home and go to bed. Bye. She was like, what? You're leaving me here by myself after forcing me to watch that? And she's like, you are the worst. I was like, I'm really sorry, Mom. I didn't think you'd be scared. So I definitely...
Oh, Mom.
I definitely did not respect her boundaries. And because at that time, I just didn't understand where that boundary was being drawn for her. I did not force her to watch a movie after that.
I wonder if her boundaries were also evolving with you as far as telling you, I didn't like that. She probably, I'm trying to put myself in her shoes, and I'm guessing that when she was starting to feel scared, she wanted to tell you, but maybe she was like, well, maybe it's not going to be so bad. I don't know what she was thinking. And so it's interesting to think back on it and to think if we could go back and ask her, like, where would it have been where she would have been like, Sadina, no.
Or if I would have listened, which is part of the problem in my early adulthood, is that I had a hard time respecting the boundaries that I didn't understand because they didn't align with mine.
Ooh. And that's definitely something that I think we see a lot of with movie watchers and even with different types of genres. When you tell someone you like horror, they're just like, ooh, no, not for me. And as someone who loves horror, I want to tell them why horror is so great. And a lot of times people don't want to listen. They clearly set their boundary at horror.
Yeah.
So now I think we're going to go into boundaries in horror and what our personal boundaries are.
Okay, I really have two very specific boundaries, and I'll go ahead and talk about one of them first because this is one that we definitely 1,000% agree on.
Yes.
But Paranormal Activity is something I could never, ever, you can't pay me enough. It's not going to happen. I won't watch the others in the series. I saw the first one on a whim going with friends to the theater. I was scared before we got into the theater because we were in line and we could hear the movie goers before us reacting to Paranormal Activity. I had not seen trailers. I did not know what movie we were going to see. My friend had paid. I was going in completely blind and sat through that movie and was terrified. My friend was next to me. He cried. I couldn't get up at the end of the movie right away because I was so scared. I couldn't leave the theater. I just didn't want to go back out into the world where, for me personally, I suffer from night terrors, and I suffered from night terrors much more frequently when I was younger, and they were fairly horrific. I also was a sleepwalker during higher times of stress in my life. My mom would find me slamming doors in the hallway and trying to go into the towel closet. The door in my mom's house, my bedroom door was the only door that had a key lock for the outside where I could be locked in. Yeah, that's how bad it got.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, my mom was not about that life.
Wow. Wow. I mean, yeah, I could see why paranormal was a real, I don't want to say trigger for you, but it was a real boundary setter for you. Like you, I went to the movie theater to watch it with a boyfriend at the time, and this boyfriend of mine, we both loved horror, and that was our thing. We watched a lot of horror together, and we heard about this movie, and I'm gonna be honest with you guys, the trailer of Paranormal reminded me of the trailer of Blair Witch, and I watched Blair Witch, and I was like, that wasn't scary, so I can do this. Yeah, no. I could not do it. We went into the theater, we watched the movie, and one of the things that I pride myself on is always keeping my door open when I sleep, because if anything was to happen, at the time I was living with my parents, and so I could easily just go to my parents. So my door was always open. And in the movie, their door is open a lot in their bedroom, and you see stuff, and that freaked me out. I had never seen that before. Like, I think they had put powder on the floor at one point.
Yeah.
And, you know, you saw the footsteps, and I was like, oh my God. It was that kind of stuff. The footsteps, you know, the sheets coming up above their feet. I couldn't, oh my God, I couldn't stand that. And then, like, watching the lady, I think her name was Katie, watching her stand over her husband. Oh, it just, like, all of it, like, it was, like, and they're just kind of mundane things, you know, just thinking about, like, you see footsteps on the ground or whatever. It's not overly scary, but to me, it was really, really scary. I remember after watching the movie, I was just frozen almost. I just didn't know what to do. And I remember going home and telling my parents, like, hey, we're all gonna sleep in the living room. Like, I made them sleep on one couch and I slept on the other, and I had the couches put together. Just in case someone tried to drag me out of I mean, my worst enemy is my own imagination when it comes to horror, and I really let it get away with me with that one. And I didn't sleep for a couple weeks. It was too much. Like you, I never watched the rest of the series. I don't care to watch the rest of the series. I don't want to watch the first one ever again. It's just a hard no for me.
Agreed. It's funny because your imagination was your worst enemy in that, whereas mine was the reality of those very like benign things like footprints or blankets or standing over someone when you sleepwalk. Those things happened to me regularly, especially in times of high stress, which, I mean, like, in all honesty, was a lot of my life. I don't have it too bad here. I didn't have it too bad in Boston either, but one of the last times I had really bad night terrors, I found myself standing at my open apartment door, staring out into the courtyard. And that week I had progressively gotten further outside of my apartment.
Wow.
The more I had, you know, a night terror or a sleepwalking incident. And even as a young child, I was told that, okay, this is really creepy, and I wish Nadine was here to reaffirm this, or that my papa, because he was the one who apparently would overhear it. But when we were really, really young, we had just moved back to Houston. We shared a room, and I had a habit as an older sister to either read her to sleep or sing lullabies to her to sleep. And my papa one morning commented on how he didn't realize that I had learned so much Hebrew from synagogue. And I was like, I don't know any Hebrew. And he was like, what? But I hear you singing to Nadine to put her to sleep at night. And I was like, that's not what's happening. And he was like, oh. And then he just kind of like dropped. But I remember being terrified.
Oh my God, I'm terrified. Because what was that?
Yeah, I think a part of it was my brain, because I don't sleep well to begin with. At least this is what I've rationalized as I've gotten older. I think what was happening was that I was so devoted to putting her to sleep and keeping her to sleep so that she wouldn't disrupt our mom or the other people in the household, that I would maybe continue to sing in my sleep and not realize it. But I don't know why I was singing in Hebrew, because the only thing I know in Hebrew is my prayers.
Wow, that's spooky.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
My parasomnias I've had all of them. Every parasomnia you can think of, from sleep paralysis to sleep talking to sleepwalking, has occurred to me at different points in my life. So watching Paranormal Activity and it being this whole build up to demonic possession or something like that really freaked me out. It freaked me out.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that, if I had experienced even just an ounce of what you experienced, for sure, that wouldn't have been on my to watch list. And if I had gotten, a friend had taken me casually to see it, I would have been like, yeah, no. You know, I mean, it probably would have hit a lot of triggers for me.
It definitely got me. It also, because shortly after that, I think the next year, my sleepwalking escalated, and that's when my mom put a lock on my door to lock me in to my bed.
Wow.
Because she said that she like saw me in her room one night, and she like woke up, you know, with that like mother's sixth sense of like her child in the room. She said she woke up and that I was just standing in the doorway, and she was like, Dina, are you okay? What's wrong? What's up? And I just stood there and stared at nothing, and that I wouldn't answer her. And then she got freaked out, and she like slowly coerced me back into my room, and then like closed the door shut and locked it. And she was like, this is the last time.
Oh my God. Yeah, I imagine that would freak me out. Like, one of the things that I always say is in horror movies, I never trust the little kid or the old lady. And if I was like your mom, I would just be like, oh my gosh, it's my kid. My kid is the scary person. Like, I can imagine how scared she was.
And in that house, we had a lot of weird stuff happen as we lived in that very haunted house. But it was me acting out night terrors or whatever that really pushed her over the edge of I can't deny this anymore.
Right. Yeah. Hey, I would have locked you up too.
I mean, fair. When she gave me the key to my door, I was like, oh, wait, do you want me to start paying rent? And she was like, no, just you need to be locked in at night. And I was like, oh.
Oh man, that's a really tough one. And I can imagine how it brought you back watching Paranormal. For me, it would have brought up a lot of anxiety. So what are some other movies that are boundaries for you?
My next big boundary movie is definitely The Fourth Kind.
Oh yeah, that's a bad one.
Yeah, The Fourth Kind. Something about aliens and loss of sleep and loss of reality, and maybe that all goes back to my parasomnias and my time loss issues from having night terrors, but the idea that something else was affecting me, that really, I mean, it got me bad. I was over at a friend's house and she was like, oh, you should watch it. And I was like, okay. She didn't let me sleep over. Like, it was kind of a repeat of me and my mom and Prometheus. Which is maybe why I like was better able to respect my mom's boundaries after that, was because when it turned around on me, I was like, oh, this sucks. I hate it. But yeah, The Fourth Kind not only scared me so bad, but like the owls, the barn owls.
Oh gosh, yeah. So I'm not much for sci-fi horror. Like, I'll watch it, but I don't care for it. So I definitely understand how that one was really terrible, especially like you said, the owls. One of my friends who is Hispanic told me that owls are like bad omens. When I was watching The Fourth Kind, I thought of that.
That's interesting because I was focused more on the found footage element where it was split screen.
Oh, yeah.
That freaked me out. But also the, because it took place in Alaska, right?
Yeah.
So the idea of isolation horror.
Oh gosh. And that's another one that I can't wait to cover, isolation horror.
Oh, we've got some good stuff to talk about.
So one of the movies that I have is The Witch, which is available on Netflix. And it's not necessarily isolation horror, but they are isolated in their little place. And I had never finished that movie.
Really?
I think I got maybe 10 or 15 minutes in and I was like, yeah, this is a hard no. I can't watch this.
Huh.
It was too bleak. I felt sad. I felt scared. And I felt just so completely uncomfortable watching it. I only got to maybe 10 or 15 minutes in, so I didn't really get a good grasp on the storyline or where it was going before I was like, this is a hard no for me.
Wow.
Yeah, and I've never finished it. And a lot of people I know are like, you gotta watch it, it's so good. And I'm like, no.
I watched it on the recommendation of our mutual friend.
Yeah, he's the one who told me to watch it.
He's a big fan of A24 Studios, and I watched it. I didn't find it scary. I wouldn't say I found it boring, but it definitely was atmospheric. It's not my favorite A24 film. That honor goes to Midsummer by far.
Yes. It was really the atmosphere that did it for me. I don't think they were isolated, but they were isolated in their own house and the forest, and it freaks me out, and nope.
Well, and they were kind of isolated from even their local settlements because they had a disagreement on a religious issue, and so the father upped the family and moved them further into the wilds.
Yeah, and when you bring religion into horror, that's another one where I'm just like, that's a hard no. And I guess because they were so far deep into their religious beliefs that it freaked me out too.
When I lived in Boston, I lived there for 5 years, and in all the 5 years I lived there, I honestly expected to experience, if not the same level of activity I had experienced everywhere else in my life, but maybe more.
Mm-hmm.
And I really didn't. Living there was actually fairly calm.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, there's, oh my gosh, everything there is thickly settled. So it's this idea that everybody's living on top of each other in this very small square mileage.
Mm-hmm.
So between suburbs or whatever, there are these large swaths of land that there's nobody on. That's unnerving to have that much undeveloped land as a Texan, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, it is because, we developed some land here, okay?
Yeah, we develop some land, but we also ensure that we develop far more than we need.
Exactly. Because here everything's bigger.
Yes, urban sprawl is somehow a visual comfort compared to being in Boston and driving on 2 West and then all of a sudden be in like backwoods.
Yeah, no. When you go to the backwoods and it's dreary and it's bleak, I guess that for me, that type of atmosphere is very scary. So I
Mm.
couldn't imagine living there and driving somewhere and then automatically being thrust in the backwoods where there's undeveloped land. Maybe that's just because I've lived in this city, quote unquote, for most of my life. I don't know.
Maybe being a city girl definitely changes your perception of your environment. But also because that area was settled by Puritans or religious isolated groups, there's a lot of weirdly named things. I lived in Worcester or Worcester. I'm never going to pronounce that correctly. Whatever. It's fine, guys. It's spelled like Worcester. It's not pronounced that way at all. But when I lived there and I was interning, I drove through this natural, oh, what are they called? So I drove through this thing called Purgatory Chasm.
Uh-huh.
And it was beautiful, first off, gorgeous, especially when I got to drive through it during fall or spring. Y'all, seasons change everything.
Oh, I miss seasons.
But to drive through it, I was like, why is this place called Purgatory Chasm? Like, that is some foreboding. I'm not a fan.
I can honestly say if I had seen that with like my group of friends, I would have been like, maybe we should turn back. I've watched enough horror movies in my life. I know we need to turn around.
Yeah, it was not great. And I remember thinking, like, why would you name this like this? Why people?
Yeah, they obviously have not watched enough horror in their lives.
And that's something that we also have in common. I can't do possession. I can't do possessed kids in particular.
Yes, because like they say, it's never a kid, it's something else. You think it's a cute little kid that's coming to get you, but it's not a kid. There's a demon in there, probably a really bad one.
Right. Ugh, can't do it. I've never seen The Possession, and I have not seen it specifically because it hits all of my notes. It is religious horror, but it's religious horror centered around and inspired by a Jewish artifact. And as a Jewish individual, I'm not going to watch something about a haunted Jewish artifact. And then it's a possessed child. That's all of the no's for me. I can't do it. I'm not going to watch something about the Dybbuk box possessing a child.
Right. Yeah, I've never watched it either. I don't plan on watching it just because when I learned about the Dybbuk box, I was like, there's no way you're gonna ever make me watch that movie. Like you, the religious horror is not on my to-do list of things to watch when it comes to horror. I watched the first Conjuring and that was it. I will never watch any of the rest of them. I don't care for any type of demonic possession movie whatsoever. You can't pay me to watch those. And then finding out that the spirit that is in those movies is in a Raggedy Ann doll somewhere in Florida. Like that freaks me out. Is it in Florida now? I don't know. That I could be wrong about that, but I don't want to have anything to do with it. I don't want to see those movies. I don't care. It's not on my list of things to do. I do have a mild boundary with movies like The Exorcist because The Exorcist was done so long ago. It definitely scared me when I watched it way back when, but I think I could watch it again. I don't know. That's one that I don't know.
The Exorcism of Emily Rose, I really thoroughly enjoyed, but I really thoroughly enjoyed it because of the science debunking in the movie.
Oh yeah, that one was a good one. And like you said, the scientific attempts were really good surrounding that movie, and I really enjoyed that one. I would watch that one again. But I do have another mild one that it would be on a case-by-case basis, and that's a lot of Japanese horror remakes like The Ring and The Grudge. nostalgia. I enjoyed those for what they were until the moments they brought them into real life. Like in The Ring, when she comes out of the TV, I was like, oh my God, that's just not okay.
Yeah, that was definitely the more frightening part, especially because of the way she came out. She still seemed like she was a 8mm jumping film, even though she was
Yes.
coming into the real world.
Yeah, and so when she came into the real world, I was like, yeah, it's time to turn this movie off. So, yeah. But other than that, I enjoy Japanese horror up until they do something like that to me, like
Well, you know, a lot of other world films capture the psychological aspects of horror more intimately. You know, I feel like a lot of American horror filmmakers have only recently started to stray from jump scares and those cheap thrills. And a lot of world horror movies are so much more insidious.
Yes, I agree. I think for sure, like the movies are evolving from, like you said, jump scares and like slasher and gore to more, I don't want to say in your face, but in your mind, psychological type stuff. And that's really, really scary to me. But I enjoy it. I enjoy it because it's horror on a deeper level almost.
Yeah, I started watching I Am the Pretty Thing That Lives in the House on Netflix.
Mm-hmm.
And our friend M had told me that it was boring and not to watch it. I remembered wanting to watch it, so I started watching it yesterday, and it's definitely slow, but I can already enjoy some of that slow build to it. You know, like I kind of see where it's going. I think I already have it figured out. I stopped about halfway through to watch something else, and I really think that I was enjoying that slow build to that reveal because it was very atmospheric. It was very classic psychological self-haunting almost of like a creepy house and a creepy old lady. I enjoyed it. I can't wait to finish it.
I like the psychological horrors. One of my favorite directors is M. Night Shyamalan. And a lot of the movies that he's done, not a lot of them are horror. Only like one or two of them are actual horror movies. But he does that psychological thriller where he's using your mind against you. Those are my favorite types of films. I overthink things. And so when I watch films that are using your own mind against you, I feel like the movie lives on a little bit longer in myself and I remember it a little bit better than I would, say, a regular jump scare movie.
I think that that's what the main benefit of consuming horror is, to have that part stick with you and become something that you constantly investigate and look at through different lenses and different time periods of your life and try to reevaluate.
I mean, because we're always reevaluating everything in our lives, so why not reevaluate how we intake horror and how it helps us set our boundaries?
Yeah, there was a book that I read maybe it was this last summer. We were all back from quarantine. The building was closed. And me and a couple of the other librarians were reading Daughters Unto Devils by Mary Lukavics. And the cover scares me the most. It's as if the witch, you know, it's this isolated Puritan family, and they actually try to move westward a bit to better their lives. And some stuff happens like out on the prairie and the plains. That was the scarier part to me, was the isolation in these prairies and plains, the fears of being lost in the plains of America. You know, the consistency and the flatness of the land and the wheat and everything just bled into each other. A man could lie down for a nap and get up and die because he was lost.
Oh, that's very creepy.
That's where the Daughters Unto Devil sort of takes place. That doesn't name it specifically. I'm not a fan of this idea that like you lie down and these perfectly normal fields of wheat and you wake up and you're so disoriented from the lack of visual landmarkers that you lose yourself basically in a field and you die.
Yeah, just listening to you talk about it makes me feel very uncomfortable because I could imagine it happening to someone like myself who, like I said, I've lived in the city most of my life, so I wouldn't even know where to go or how I would even attempt to get out of a situation like that. And to hear about it is very, very anxiety inducing. Just sitting here on my bed talking to you.
Yeah, it was very creepy. Daughters of the Devils, we read it and Taylor loved it. I also enjoyed it, but it was the parts that scared me the most were not like the potential demon baby or the corpses or the whatever it was, like all the weird like gorier things.
Yeah.
It was the idea that this family had gotten themselves into a position where they could very likely die or kill each other off by going insane.
Wow, that's so scary.
Oh, so creepy.
So much like Daughters onto Devil, one of the things that I had to reevaluate is my love of the character Freddy Krueger. Like I said, my first horror movie that I've ever watched is Nightmare on Elm Street. I love the series. Every Halloween, that's what I'm watching. But there was a remake done, I think it was in 2010. It featured a new guy starring as Freddy Krueger. For those that don't know, Freddy used to kill children. The neighborhood banded together and they killed him, but he came back as a paranormal entity and he would haunt your dreams. The remake really did a number on me because they really focused on him and the kids before he was killed. The story is that he was actually a pedophile. Yeah, and it made me very uncomfortable to like this villain that I grew up my whole life liking. You know, 80s horror was almost comical in a way, and so to see this darker turn on a character that I'd loved for so long was really scary, but I had to really take a look at my boundaries with horror in a way because I never thought of Freddy that way before until this movie came out. And if you look back on it, why was he killing children? Maybe he was doing that, they just didn't focus on it, you know?
Yeah.
The remake, I will say, was fantastically done. It freaked me out. And I think that's the point of horror for me, is to make me really think about things. And so I really enjoyed it for what it was. I don't necessarily like Freddy as much as I used to, but you know, I try to separate the old 80s one from the new one. And I kind of wish that they would have continued on with the newer set, but it didn't get a lot of traction as far as moviegoers.
Yeah, I had no clue that there was a remake.
Yeah, I mean, I follow Wes Craven almost religiously. So when that one came out, I had to watch it.
You know, oh God, I guess that's another line of mine, is the scary element that the villain is a pedophile or an abuser of some sort. Like that really gets in my head because of my own like family drama and family history. Like when that type of stuff hits too close to home, it really, like with Paranormal Activity, it's hard to see that stuff on the big screen played out. But I guess in another way, it did help me cope with my own. So for the parasomnias in high school and then in my early 20s, I got really big into neuroscience and the research into parasomnias. There's not a lot of research out there, but what research there is, I devoured it. I was determined to discover that I was not demonically possessed.
I mean, we laugh, but it's so serious.
Right. It's like that may have been an absurd drive of mine, but to read all of the neuroscience behind why the brain does the things it does helped a lot. And it helped me reevaluate those boundaries and understand what triggered my parasomnias.
Yeah.
Understanding that high levels of stress in the daytime was exacerbating my night terrors makes a lot of sense now, but I didn't know that as a kid.
Right. Why would you be expected to know that as a kid? And it's good that you were able to figure it out, even in not adulthood, but close to adulthood.
Right. Because I still don't sleep well or for long periods of time. There was a few years in my life where I had to sleep with earplugs because every noise shift in the air triggered a night terror in my mind because my mind was hearing those things and manipulating them into night terrors.
Wow. And I mean, I think that really gets us to how our minds and our thoughts and what happens with us mentally triggers a lot of things that are horror and horrific in life, right? One of the things that we wanted to talk about is like haunting yourself. For me, it's a mental game. And to hear you talking about it, it brings me back to thinking like, wow, had you recognized it when you were younger, which how can we even expect you to do it when you were younger? But how much different would it have been? Would it have been different?
Or would it have been detrimental to the later trauma I experienced, because the ways that I coped with so little sleep and so much night terrors and so many parasomnias in general helped me cope with the later abuses and trauma that I experienced in my early 20s, late teens. And I was able to cope with those things and push through them and to adapt, not crumble, not implode, not become this thing that couldn't handle what life was giving to me. Understanding horror is really important. You don't know what your future holds.
Right. I mean, you're a kick-ass person now, so you know what I mean? So it really built you up to the strong human, I feel, can grab life by its ass and really just take charge.
Well, I appreciate that. I've had a similar statement made to me a few years ago, right before I moved to Boston.
I don't think you realize how motivational you are to others because you're so open about talking about these things and being open with us. We talk about wanting to be open with horror, and I don't know that I would have wanted to be so open with horror if I hadn't met you. Like I probably wouldn't have started this podcast.
Well, then I'm glad because I feel that communication helps. I was unaware of how normal my upbringing kind of was as the basis of a single mom, a divorced mom. To find out later in life that those things were perfectly normal, I wish I had been more open discussing them as a child because I feel like I wouldn't have had so many hangups about my father or, we'll go with that, my dad.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, and in turn, we have a lot of conversations that obviously were not recorded, but it's really helped me as a single parent have conversations with my child. And a lot of our conversations are actually not about parenthood, it's about horror, but it really is inspiring to me to be able to correlate some of the things that I've read in horror and watched in horror, bounce it off of you, and we talk about the themes behind them and what they really influence us to do. And it's really helped me communicate better with my child. I appreciate it, and I hope that we can inspire others to not only openly communicate with their loved ones, but learn to use horror as a method of evolution within themselves.
I appreciate the compliment, but I also am really glad that it's helped just in your own personal life with your own kiddo because kids are freaking smart, y'all. They know way more and they understand and see way more than we give them credit for. And protecting them as if they are a blank slate, innocent thing is not always the safest thing to their mental development.
And I think by allowing them to expose themselves to life and, we're here to help, but to allow them that freedom to decide for themselves what's good and what's not, you can help guide them by all means, for sure, guide your kids. But it's good to give them that freedom to allow themselves to experiment a little bit just because they know their boundaries a little bit better than we do because we're not them.
Right. Our fears are not their fears and we should not make them their fears.
Exactly.
And that's why we try to remind you guys, don't yuck a yum. It's
That's right.
yeah, it's horror, but it doesn't have to be frightening for all the same reasons for everyone.
And take this time to discover your boundaries within horror. Let us know what your boundaries are. Let us know what movies you don't watch and what books you don't read because they've clearly crossed that boundary.
Oh, you know what I was thinking of as we recorded? If there ever comes a time where we have the nerve, maybe we could record a reaction to something that we normally would not have watched.
Ooh,
right?
yes.
Wouldn't that be fun?
Yes.
But not anytime soon, guys. So sorry.
Yeah, not anytime soon. Not after this episode. And now I've got to think about all the things that I said I was never gonna watch again. So I gotta go watch Bridgerton and get over all this fear.
Same. I think I'm gonna go watch maybe Crag of the Creek, which is adorable. It's on HBO.
Wait, say it again.
It's on HBO. It's Crag of the Creek, and it is so cute. I'm a big fan.
That's gonna be on my to-watch list then next. Alrighty, guys. I think we're gonna call it a day. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.
If you liked listening to us ramble on about horror, subscribe to our podcast and tell your friends. And if you would like to follow us on social media, you can find us on Instagram or Facebook at LLOTL Podcast.
Check out our website by going to lastlibraryontheleft.com. Be sure to visit our About Us page to discover our 2 truths and a lie. Or, if you'd like to send us an email, you can reach us at somethingwicked@lastlibraryonTheLeft.com.